The applause wasn't for me, even though my work was on the screen. My name wasn't on the slide, even though I could recognize every line. I kept smiling because everyone was watching what I would do next, and I understood all at once how easy it had become to erase me. It was a Tuesday boardroom presentation. Glass walls, city view, water bottles lined up like props. We were sharing a new customer retention model with senior leadership, weeks of analysis reduced to 10 clean slides. My manager, Graham, held the clicker like he owned the room. When the final slide appeared, the one with projected savings and a tidy graph climbing upward, he paused. "I want to thank Chloe for driving this work," he said, nodding to my colleague across the table. Chloe blinked, surprised, then recovered with a polite smile. I felt my breathing turn careful. My hands stayed folded on my notebook. I even nodded once like it was reasonable. Chloe had helped with a few interviews and notes. The model itself, the structure, the logic, the late-night reconciliation with finance had been mine. The rewrite after legal raised concerns had been mine. The deck I'd sent at 11:43 p.m. on Sunday had been mine. Nobody corrected him. Meetings have a way of sealing stories into place. When it ended, people stood, chatting in that upbeat tone that says, "We've done something important." A director clapped Graham on the shoulder. Someone joked about the next project. I said, "Great work, everyone," because I knew the unspoken rule: don't make the room uncomfortable. In the corridor, Chloe caught my eye. "I didn't know he was going to say that," she whispered. "I know," I said, and I meant it. She looked more uneasy than pleased. Back at my desk, the feeling didn't fade. I opened the project folder. The version history held my initials in a long chain of edits. The workbook's audit trail showed who built each tab. My email to Graham was still there, final deck attached. Notes in speaker section. The evidence existed, the acknowledgement didn't. That afternoon, Graham scheduled my quarterly check-in. He sat opposite me with his laptop open and his expression set to friendly. "Leadership loved the presentation," he said. "Great momentum." "I'm glad it landed," I replied. I noticed my name wasn't included on the deck. He blinked once. "The deck had to be tight, names aren't always necessary. You thanked Chloe for driving it." He leaned back. "Chloe did a lot of stakeholder wrangling. And you," his eyes flicked to the screen, "you're a strong individual contributor. Valuable behind the scenes." It was the same phrase he'd used since he joined, behind the scenes. I'd started at the company 2 years earlier, after moving from Manchester to Leeds for my partner's job. The firm had offices across the UK, Canada, and Australia, and loved to talk about ownership and recognition. In my interview, they said they valued calm thinkers. I believed them because calmness was my default. Then Graham arrived as head of insights, confident, polished, always speaking as if the world had already agreed with him. In our first one-on-one, he said, "You're solid, reliable, not flashy but solid." It sounded like praise, it behaved like a ceiling. After that, the pattern was subtle enough to doubt. I would send a clear summary email after a cross-team meeting. Graham would forward it to leadership with a new opening line and his name at the bottom. I would propose a fix for recurring data gaps. 2 weeks later, Graham would introduce the same idea in a meeting, with a light laugh as if it had just occurred to him. When I asked about a senior analyst role, he said, "You're not quite there yet. Leadership needs presence. You're brilliant behind the scenes." He gave presentations I had built. He handed development opportunities to people who were good at being seen. I tried to adapt, speaking up more, volunteering, asking for feedback. Graham would nod and say, "Good. Keep pushing," then he'd assign the visible work to someone else. The worst part wasn't one incident, it was the slow erosion of certainty. You start asking yourself if you're imagining it, if you're too sensitive, if you should be grateful and quiet. After the boardroom slide, something in me clicked shut, small and final, not anger. Clarity. That evening, I booked a small meeting room and wrote a timeline. Not emotions, facts, dates, projects, deliverables, what happened afterwards. Then I gathered what already existed. Emails, Teams messages, meeting notes, file histories. Nothing dramatic, no hacking, just receipts from the bottom of an ordinary working week. When I laid it out, the shape was undeniable. My drafts became his announcements. My ideas became his strategy. My work became someone else's growth. Before I spoke to HR, I did one thing I hadn't told anyone. I booked a half-hour call with an employment solicitor. Not to threaten the company and not to go legal, but to understand what was reasonable and what was naive. She listened while I described it in plain terms: repeated misattribution, lost opportunities, a manager controlling visibility. She asked gently, "Do you have anything in writing?" "I do," I said. "Good," she replied. "Then keep it factual, ask for an internal process first, and don't hand over your only copy of anything. If you make a report, ask for outcomes in writing." When I ended the call, I didn't feel litigious. I felt steadier, like someone had given me a map instead of telling me to be brave in the dark. A week later, I requested a meeting with HR. I used calm wording, concern about attribution and development opportunities. I have documentation. The HR partner, Priya, met me in a quiet office with posters about respect on the wall. She didn't look alarmed, she looked attentive. Tell me what's been happening, she said. I started with the boardroom moment because it was clean, public, witnessed, easy to place in time. Then I widened to the pattern, showing emails where I delivered work and emails where Graham presented it as his team's output without naming me. Priya read carefully. Have you raised this with Graham? She asked. Yes, he said names aren't necessary. And what outcome are you looking for? I thought about how easily office conversations turn into theater. I didn't want theater. I want accurate recognition, I said, and fair consideration for roles. I want this to stop. During the review, Priya asked me questions that sounded almost mundane but mattered, whether I'd ever been excluded from meetings I should have attended, whether my role description matched what I was actually delivering, whether I'd received any written feedback about presence. I showed her my last appraisal, strong results. Needs more visibility, no concrete examples. She also asked how it had affected me. I kept my answer controlled but honest. I've started double-checking myself, I said. I reread emails before sending them because I'm trying to sound less present. I've stopped volunteering because I assume it won't count. Priya nodded in a way that told me she'd heard this pattern before. At her request, I wrote a short statement for the case file, 1 page, dates and examples. It felt oddly clinical, but it also meant the story couldn't be reshaped later. Once it was written down, it belonged to the record, not to office mood. A week after my follow-up, the company quietly introduced a new template for leadership decks. A footer listing contributors, and a requirement that the presenter confirm authorship in the submission form. It was framed as good governance. Nobody said my name and nobody had to. The change itself was the acknowledgement. Priya nodded. If we proceed formally, we'll review records, speak to Graham, and potentially interview others. Are you prepared for that? My throat tightened slightly. I could feel the risk in the word prepared. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. Over the next 2 weeks, HR requested file audit trails from IT and reviewed project repositories. Priya asked me for key dates. She spoke to stakeholders who had received Graham's updates. She interviewed Chloe, who confirmed she hadn't led the work. She interviewed others who cautiously said they assumed I was involved but hadn't known the extent. The process was strangely grounding. An audit trail doesn't care who is charming. A timestamp doesn't care who is senior. A forwarded email is still a forwarded email. Graham acted as if nothing had changed until one afternoon he stopped at my desk. I hear you've raised something with HR, he said quietly, smiling in a way that didn't warm his eyes. Yes, I said, he chuckled. You know how these things get, miscommunications, perceptions. I'd hate for you to be seen as difficult. It wasn't a threat exactly, it was a warning shaped like concern. I've provided documentation, I said. It's not about perception. His smile held for a second too long. Right, well, let's keep things positive. After he walked away, my hands were cold. In the bathroom mirror, I looked tired, not dramatic, but I also looked like someone who had stopped bargaining for basic fairness. Priya booked a follow-up. Her email subject line was deliberately bland. Check-in. In the meeting, she spoke in careful HR language. Based on the information reviewed, we've identified discrepancies in work attribution. We have documented evidence that your contributions were not represented accurately in several instances. I didn't feel victorious. I felt confirmed, Priya continued. We are addressing this with Graham as a leadership conduct issue. There will be oversight on attribution going forward. We also want to discuss your development plan and role progression. She slid a draft plan across the table. My name was printed beside lead analyst on relevant projects. A new guideline required decks to include a contributor's footer. The senior analyst role would be reopened, and I was encouraged to apply. There were no dramatic punishments. Organizations rarely deliver moral endings, they deliver risk management. Priya added, Graham disputes parts of your account. He says he was positioning others for development. I nodded. He positions others using my work, I said, still calm. We have the file and email records, she replied. That's why we're confident in our findings. When I left her office, the corridor looked exactly the same as it always had: neutral carpet, soft lighting, people carrying coffee. But I felt different. Not bigger, clearer. The next month, we had another senior leadership review. My name was on the first slide under prepared by. No fanfare, no apology. Just a plain line of text, like the truth was always supposed to be there. Graham introduced the session, then hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying, I'll hand over to my name, who led the analysis. He sounded as if he was reading a requirement. That was enough. I presented without rushing, answered questions without over-explaining, and stayed steady when someone challenged an assumption. I had the backup data ready. I didn't perform confidence, I just did the work in the open. Afterwards, a director named Emma stopped beside me. Strong presentation, she said. Clear thinking. Thank you, I replied. She looked thoughtful. We need to make sure we're not missing people who are doing the real building. I nodded once. I didn't add anything. I didn't need to. The record was finally speaking for me. I interviewed for the reopened senior analyst role with a panel that didn't include Graham. The questions were practical: how I built models, how I handled stakeholder conflict, how I maintained quality under pressure. I answered honestly. I didn't make it about him. I made it about my work because that's what I'd always wanted. 2 days before Christmas, I got the offer email: a promotion, a pay rise, a clearer path. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not because I doubted it, but because I was noticing what I felt. It wasn't joy in a loud way. It was relief and a quiet sadness for how long I had trained myself to accept less. That evening, after my partner fell asleep, I opened the folder of documents one more time. Part of me wanted to delete it all, as if the evidence was something shameful. Another part wanted to keep it as proof I could trust my own perception. I saved it in an encrypted file and wrote a final note to myself: you were not imagining it. In January, Graham moved to another division. It was described as a strategic realignment. There was no public reckoning, no hallway gossip that turned into a spectacle. That might sound unsatisfying if you want someone to be publicly humbled. But I didn't want humiliation. I'd had enough of that. I wanted the pattern to end. And it did, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a process that made the truth hard to ignore. In the months that followed, I practiced something that still felt new: gentle correction in real time. When someone summarized my idea as theirs, I said calmly, yes, that's the approach I suggested earlier. I can walk through the reasoning again. The first time, my hands shook under the table. The second time, less. By the third, it felt normal. Dignity, I learned, isn't a pose. It's a boundary you keep quietly, even when nobody claps. In March, a new graduate joined our team, eager and nervous. In her first week, she stayed late, finished a report, and emailed it to me apologizing for bothering me. I replied the next morning with edits and a line at the end: you did solid work. When we share this, your name will be on it. She wrote back, thank you, and I could almost feel the weight lift from someone at the very start of their working life. The office around me hummed as usual: keyboards, distant phone calls, a kettle clicking off in the kitchen. Nothing cinematic, nothing loud. Just a small correction to the kind of workplace I wanted to be in. And when the next quarterly deck went out with my name on it as naturally as any other line, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, because I was no longer disappearing.